The wasteland smelled like old iron and ozone, the way the sky smells right before lightning finds the ground. Kale noticed this because blood had taught him to notice everything, and because in 7 years of roving the scorch, the things you failed to notice were the things that killed you. Blood wasn't a dog anymore, not exactly. He hadn't been just a dog since the Reach War. Since whatever the Veth had pumped into the atmosphere in the final days of the bombardment had done something strange and irreversible to the neural lattice of every mammal within 300 kilometers of the impact zones. Kale had been 11 years old. Blood had been 2. They had both come out of the bunker changed. Kale with scarring on his left side from a secondary burn and a strange, permanent ringing in one ear, and Blood with a voice inside Kale's head that was wry and tired and knew more about pre-war literature than any 18-year-old wasteland rat had any right to expect from a shepherd mix. That voice said, "Now, there are 2 of them on the ridge. One's wounded." Kale didn't move. He was lying flat in the shadow of a crumbled overpass pylon, a salvaged Veth pulse converter on the ground beside him, 3 hours into the business of stripping it for copper and rare earth cells. The converter had been inside a dead Veth scout, which Kale had not killed. It had died in the night, probably of radiation seep, probably alone. He didn't feel bad about taking from it. You didn't survive the scorch by feeling bad about things. Which one's wounded? He thought back. He'd stopped talking aloud to Blood years ago. Too much sound in the scorch was an invitation. The smaller one. Something took a bite out of its flank. I can smell it from here. Not human blood. Veth blood smells like copper sulfate. I know what Veth blood smells like, Kale. He smiled at the underside of the pylon. Blood was 60 meters back, tucked under the frame of a collapsed ground vehicle, ears up watching. That was their system. Blood watched. Kale worked. If Blood stopped watching, Kale stopped working. It had kept them alive longer than it should have. He risked a look. The ridge was a broken line of pre-war highway that ran east-west and caught the morning light wrong, so anything on it was briefly silhouetted at this hour. He saw them. 2 Veth scouts, bipedal but wrong-limbed, with that characteristic hinge at the second knee that always made humans feel vaguely nauseated until they learned to stop noticing it. One was moving with a stiff, dragging cadence. The other was crouched beside it, upper limbs working at the wound. "They're not hunting," T-Blood said. "They're stranded." "Same thing. Eventually, you know," T the dog said, and Kale could hear the specific dryness that meant Blood was about to say something instructive. "I sometimes wonder if your inability to distinguish between currently threatening and theoretically threatening is going to be what finally does you in. Have you considered that it hasn't yet? I have. I consider it a statistical anomaly. The Veth finished its work on the wounded one." The smaller alien straightened, looked around once. Kale pressed himself flat, and then they moved on, heading east, where the old city cores had been, where the Veth had dug in deep and built their underspheres, those sealed underground environments that humans called the Hollows, and that Blood called, with remarkable precision, exactly what you get when a species decides that the solution to destroying a world is to stop living in it. Kale watched them go. Something sat crooked in his chest when he watched Veth move. Not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. Something older. The Reach War had been 3 years of orbital bombardment, surface assault, and attempted xenocide by a species that had decided humanity's problem was that it existed. 12 billion people before the war, something around 2.5 billion after. Kale had been born in the middle of it. His first memories were of shelters and dried food, and his mother's voice telling him stories about cities she'd seen before the burning. She'd been a good storyteller. He missed her every day with a specific physical weight like a stone in the sternum. "They're gone," T-Blood said. "You can breathe." He exhaled slowly. "I was breathing. You were not." He collected the copper and the cells, wrapped them in cloth, packed them into the carry rig on his back. He walked back to where Blood was waiting, and the dog stood and stretched with an extravagant theatrical laziness that Kale had never quite gotten used to. The pure animal pleasure of it, completely at odds with the voice in his head quoting Kipling. He sat beside Blood for a moment in the shadow of the dead vehicle. He put his hand on the dog's neck. The fur was warm from the sun, and Blood leaned into him slightly, which was as close as Blood ever got to sentimentality. "We need to find the cache at Sector 9, T-Blood said. "I haven't eaten properly in 2 days. We'll go today." "You said that yesterday. Today I mean it. You meant it yesterday, too." "The problem is your tendency to find trouble between the intention and the act." Kale looked east, where the Veth had gone. I know, he said aloud this time, quiet enough that it barely disturbed the air. Sector 9 was a pre-war distribution node that had been, in its previous life, a warehouse for agricultural equipment. It was not agricultural equipment anymore. Kale had been caching supplies here for 8 months, and the cache contained, among other things, sealed protein blocks, 2 liters of purified water, a functioning Veth-Com chip he'd pulled from a soldier and never quite brought himself to destroy, and a holographic locket his mother had given him before the camp where she'd been staying was hit. He retrieved these things in the right order. Food first for Blood, water for both of them. The com chip he handled with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had made up their mind about something and was daring themselves to unmake it. You still have that, Tet Blood said. I know you're going to tell me it has intelligence value. It might. It has been in this cache for 8 months. If it had intelligence value, that value has rotted. Blood was eating. But even with his nose in the protein block, he radiated a focused, lawyerly attention. Put it back or destroy it. The middle ground between those options is how you got yourself shot twice in the year before last, Kale. Put it in his pocket instead of back in the cache. Blood lifted his head. I saw that. I know, Kale. It has my mother's voice on its silence then. Blood went back to eating. Kale sat with his back against a support strut and took a drink of water and looked at the ceiling of the warehouse, where the old lighting rigs had been burned down to abstract shapes by the early orbital strikes. Ash and light and bent metal. He'd spent a lot of time in places like this. It stopped looking like disaster eventually. It started looking like the world. I know what it has, T. Blood said finally. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pushed. You were right. I can be right and sorry at the same time. A pause. I learned that from you, actually. You do it constantly. Kale almost laughed. He took out the com chip and held it up to the filtered light and looked at it. It was a small thing, a disc barely larger than his thumbnail, silver gray with the faint iridescent shimmer that all Veth hardware had, like oil on water. He didn't know how it had ended up carrying her voice. He'd found it on a dead Veth officer 3 years ago in a cache the officer had been guarding, and when he'd run it through Blood's translation protocols. Blood's enhancements from the bombardment included something that interfaced with certain EM frequencies in ways neither of them fully understood. It had played, in his mother's voice, 19 seconds of a lullaby she used to sing. He didn't know what the Veth had recorded it for. Intelligence, psychological profiling, cruelty. He had theories. He had eventually stopped caring about the reason and started caring only about the fact. 19 seconds. He had memorized every breath in it. He put the chip away. Sector 6 had activity last week, T. Blood said, shifting without fanfare back to operational things, the way he always did when Kale needed the distraction. 2 Veth, possibly 3. They were looking for something. The scent pattern was search and retreat, not patrol. What would they be looking for in 6? Unknown. But the search grid was centered on the old comms tower. Kyle thought about this. The comms tower in Sector 6 had been a civilian broadcast relay before the war. Humanity had tried to use it to re-establish long-range comms in the early months of the Resistance. The Veth had bombed the tower 6 years ago. There's nothing in that tower, that is what I assumed, T. Blood said. However, I may have been incorrect. Because I've been picking up a signal, KL looked at the dog. Blood's ears were slightly forward, the posture he got when he was working through something he didn't entirely want to say. What kind of signal? Human. Tight beam, heavily encoded, bouncing off Veth relay infrastructure, which is either extremely stupid or extremely clever. A pause. Given that it's been running for 6 weeks without being noticed, I suspect clever. Why didn't you tell me this 6 weeks ago? Because 6 weeks ago, you had 3 cracked ribs, and I was not going to add. Someone is using the enemy's own broadcast grid to send secret messages to the list of things you were worrying about while healing Blood. You were not sleeping. I made a judgment call. He stood up. He walked 3 paces away and turned around and looked at the dog, who looked back at him with the patient, faintly judicial expression that meant he was prepared to defend his decision at length if required. Where is the signal coming from? Kale said. Not from. 2 Blood stood. It's addressed, specifically, to a designator code that matches the Veth com chip in your pocket. The signal took them 2 days to trace, and during those 2 days, Kale slept badly and ate the last of the protein blocks and thought, with more frequency than was comfortable, about the Veth officer he'd taken the chip from. The officer had been alone, which was unusual. Officers traveled in units. and the cache the officer had been guarding had contained not weapons or resources, or the standard territorial markers of Veth patrol routes, but records, documentation, in the Veth information encoding language that Blood could partially parse, of something labeled, translated loosely, as the Preservation Archive. He hadn't known what that meant then. He was starting to have an idea now. The signal source was a woman. She was human, approximately his age, with close-cropped dark hair and a way of holding her shoulders that suggested she had been carrying weight for a long time and had learned not to show it. She was sitting in the base of the old relay tower in Sector 6 when they found her, surrounded by jury-rigged equipment that used Veth hardware components in ways Cale suspected the Veth had never intended, broadcasting through the dark in a language Blood could read. Her name was June. She had been in the tower for 3 weeks. She looked up when Blood came through the entrance first, and then Cale, and she held very still in the way of someone who had learned that any fast movement in the Scorch was a negotiation opener you did not always win. "That's a dog," she said. "Yes, dogs don't." She stopped. She looked between Cale and Blood with an expression that rat-calibrated itself twice in rapid succession, the signal translation. "That's how you read it. He reads it." "Partly," Cale said. "He reads the EM component." "I read the text." She let out a long breath. "I've been transmitting for 3 weeks. I was starting to think no one was going to come." "She's not afraid," Tati Blood said in Cale's head. "Or she is, and she's very good at not being which." "Both." I think Cale looked at the equipment. It was extraordinary work. Wasteland components and salvage and Veth hardware, strung together with a competence that went beyond survival tinkering into something that deserved the word engineering. "What are you broadcasting?" "A location and a warning." She looked at the comm chip in Cale's hand, which he'd taken out without realizing it. "I've been looking for people who have those. What do you know about it?" "I know what the Veveth recorded on it," she said. "And I know why." She had been, before the Scorch ate everything, a researcher. Not old enough to have worked before the war. She'd been 12 when the first orbital strikes hit, but trained by survivors, by the people who'd maintained the libraries and the labs in the underground shelters, and insisted, stubbornly and often pointlessly, that knowledge was worth preserving even when the world above was burning. What she had learned was this: the Veth had not come to destroy humanity. They had come to take it. Not physically, she said. They were sitting in the tower base, drinking water she'd filtered through a Veth purifier, while Blood lay between them with his head on his paws and watched everything. The Veth, their word for themselves, the one Blood probably translates as a long glottal sequence. They are not a spacefaring species by original development. They are an inheriting species. They find worlds with intelligent life, and she stopped, started again. They archive. They record everything. Language, biology, emotional signature, memory. They have technology that can encode memory. Did you know that? They've been doing it for what we would call geological time. And they bring those records back, and they integrate them. Cale was very still. The lullaby, one of hundreds of thousands of recordings. They weren't being cruel, storing her voice. To them it was. She shook her head. It was the most respectful thing they knew how to do. They thought we were dying. They thought the war was finishing us. And they were making sure we weren't lost. "Oh," T-Blood said softly in Cale's head. "Just that." "They were wrong," Cale said. "We're not dying. They're not sure about that yet." June met his eyes. "The underspheres, the hollows, they're not fortifications. They're processing centers. They're taking the records back inside, integrating what they've collected, deciding what to do next. There's a faction among them that wants to complete the war, and a faction that," she paused, "a faction that found out we're still here, still fighting, still making music and teaching our children languages and burying our dead with specific rituals and doing the 10,000 things they did not predict a species in our position would still be doing. And that faction is not sure what to do with us." "What do they want?" "They want to see," she said. "They sent out the officer you took that chip from. Low profile, single agent, observe and report. That chip is a data return node. They're waiting for it to come back. They've been waiting for 3 years. A pause. I want to give it to them. I want to send something back." "She's not asking you to fight," T-Blood said. "I know. She's asking something harder." Cale looked at the chip in his palm. 19 seconds of a lullaby. He thought about his mother's hands, which had been calloused in a specific pattern from the work she'd done before the war. Something with machines. He'd never entirely understood what. He thought about the way she'd sung. Not well, technically, a little flat on the high notes. and how that imperfection had been the most specific and irreplaceable thing about it. "What would you send?" he asked. June reached into her pack and set something on the ground between them. It was a drive, small and compact and studded with input nodes. "Everything," she said. "Everything we still are." It took them 11 days. Blood contributed things Kale hadn't known he'd been storing. The translation protocols he'd built over 7 years, which turned out to encode an implicit grammar of how humans adapted language under pressure, how meaning migrated and compressed and found new containers when the old ones broke. A record of the specific ways Kale's speech patterns had changed during his 3 cracked rib weeks. The careful shortening of sentences, the particular words he'd dropped when pain made them cost too much. June contributed recordings she'd been making for 2 years. She'd been building the archive without knowing why, driven by the researcher's instinct that documentation was the only permanent act available to temporary creatures. She had recordings of 8 settlements in the Scorch, their songs, their arguments, their children's games, their old people's stories, their dead reckoning navigation methods, their 100 improvised technologies, their specific and inventive profanity. Kale sat with the chip for a long time before he added his own piece. He recorded himself humming the lullaby. Not his mother's voice. Her voice was not his to give. But his memory of it, his 19-second reconstruction of it, slightly wrong in the places he wasn't sure about, carrying the imperfections of transmission and memory and loss. He added the places where it broke in his mind. He added the feeling, as precisely as he could, of a stone in the sternum. He gave them the weight. "That was the right thing," Kablood said. "I hope so." "I know so," T the dog said. The hollow was 2 kilometers east of the relay tower, buried under what had once been a secondary highway interchange. June knew its location because she'd tracked the return route of 6 separate Veth patrols over 4 months and triangulated the point of disappearance. She'd told Kale this with a matter-of-fact precision that reminded him, in some peripheral way, that the Scorch produced a specific kind of person, someone who had made peace with the idea that preparation was the only form of hope available and had committed to it absolutely. They went at dawn, the 3 of them, because dawn was when the Veth patrols were thinnest. Blood had established this empirically over years of observation and confirmed it via the partial translation of a patrol schedule he'd extracted from a Veth device 18 months ago. The light was flat and colorless. The ground under their feet was the particular hard-packed clay of the Scorch Zone, pale gray and cracked into irregular tiles, like something that had been ceramic once and had forgotten the specific shape of being whole. 2 guards at the entrance, T. Blood said when they were close. "They're not in combat posture. You can tell the difference?" "Kale, I have been watching Veth move for 7 years. Yes, I can tell the difference. The entrance was a pressure-sealed hatch set into the highway collapse, barely visible. You would have walked past it 100 times and not known. June had a key." This was the part she'd explained last, and the part Kale had found hardest to process. The Veth officer he'd taken the chip from had also been carrying a key, a biometric cipher that June had reverse-engineered over 6 months of focused, probably slightly obsessive work. The cipher wouldn't open all hollow doors. It would open this one. The guards. And Kale could see it now, what Blood had meant about posture. The difference between a species that was expecting trouble and a species that was waiting registered the 3 of them with the slow rotation of sensory organs that passed for a Veth look. The hinge-kneed alien on the left spoke. "It says," T-Blood said, "you have the return node." "Yes," Kale said. "The recording was expected 3 years ago. We needed time." A pause. The alien spoke again. "It says why?" Kale thought about this. He thought about 11 days of working alongside June. The way she sorted recordings by emotional register. The precise care she took with the fragments of other people's lives. He thought about Blood correcting his grammar in 3 languages during downtime. He thought about his mother, who had told him stories about cities he would never see, who had been careful to include the things that went wrong in the stories, as well as the things that went right. Because she'd believed, with the evangelical specificity of someone who'd thought hard about it, that the wrong things were where the truth lived. "Because we're not what you thought we were," Kale said. "We knew you were recording us. We wanted to record back." The alien processed this. The alien on the right hadn't moved, but something in its posture had shifted. The quality of its attention, maybe, the way attention has a texture when it sharpens. "The one on the right," T-Blood said slowly, "is asking something of the one on the left." I can't quite wait a pause. It's asking if they're different, meaning us. It's asking if what's in the node is different from what they expected to find. Tell them, Kale said, to open it and look. They were inside for 6 hours. The hollow was nothing like the ruin above. This was the thing that hit Kale in the chest the moment he came through the entrance and couldn't quite dislodge. The sheer, aggressive vitality of the place. Not the ersatz greenery of the pre-war period the archives sometimes described, but something alien and growing and genuinely alive. Veth bioluminescent structures that served as both lighting and atmospheric processors. Complex geometries that the human eye kept trying to read as architecture and giving up on. Hundreds of Veth, moving with that hinge-kneed rhythm through corridors that had no right angles. And everywhere encoded in the walls themselves, in the iridescent shimmer surfaces that Blood had always called the display medium. Data, records, the archive. They have recordings from 93 worlds, T-Blood said softly, standing pressed against Kale's leg, which was as close to shaken as Kale had ever seen him. 93 species, some still living, some not. Kyle, they have everything. Don't let them see that it's affecting you, June said quietly beside him. Too late, T-Blood said. Though, in my defense, I'm a dog, and they may not read my body language correctly. They were brought to something that might have been a chamber of authority, larger than the corridors, with a quality of light that felt deliberate. A gathering of 15 or 20 Veth, arranged in a pattern that Blood identified as the equivalent of a facing the situation formation. At the center was an individual distinguishable from the others by a quality of absolute stillness. It spoke, and Blood translated with the careful, slightly delayed precision of someone working at the edge of their capability. You survived longer than the projection model allowed. The projection model was built on every other species we have encountered. When we came to your world, the projection said 17 months to irreversible population collapse. It has been 9 years, 11, Kale said. Yes, we recalibrated 4 times. You kept exceeding the recalibration. A pause. The still one moved then, a gesture that Blood identified as either inquiry or incredulity. The Veth translation was ambiguous. Why? Kale thought about the scorch, about 11 days in a relay tower, about what it felt like to carry a sound in your memory for 3 years and know you'd gotten some of it wrong and carry it anyway. He thought about Blood, asleep in the sun with that extravagant theatrical laziness. He thought about his mother's hands. Because we're better at loss than you expected, he said. We lose things and we don't become less. We become different. We keep going. That's not a special power. That's not a strategy. That's just what we are. Blood translated. The hollow was very quiet. The still one spoke again, and Blood translated slowly, more slowly than usual. We have been integrating your records. We have encountered, in 46 instances, the encoding of individual dying, of what you call grief. In every other species we have archived, this encoding is a marker of systemic decline. The recording of loss indicates a species approaching terminus. In your records, a pause. In your records, the encoding of loss appears at the beginning of your constructions, your music, your stories, your children's counting games. You build with loss. We have not encountered this. We did not know it was a viable building material. Kale stood in an alien chamber under the earth, with a dog against his leg and a researcher at his shoulder, and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that would improve on what had just been said. Then June spoke. That's what we sent you, she said. That's the whole of it. The accord, which was not called a treaty, and was not signed with anything but the mutual acknowledgement that both species needed to stop operating on assumptions, took 3 months to negotiate. Blood spent most of those 3 months as the primary translator, and came out of it with a working Veth vocabulary of approximately 4,000 terms, and a slightly haunted quality that he dealt with by quoting Dostoevsky at length in Kale's head during the quiet evenings. Kale spent those 3 months learning, among other things, that the faction within the Veth who had wanted to complete the destruction of humanity had been losing ground for 2 years. Not because of military pressure. The human resistance, such as it was, had never had the material to genuinely threaten the underspheres. But because the archive had come back with data that didn't fit the model, because 93 species of record and not a single one had done what humanity had done, which was to spend 9 years of active orbital and surface assault continuing to teach their children songs. The Veth could not compute this. They had kept sending observers. Every observer had come back with more anomalous data. At some point, the data had achieved critical mass, and the faction that said, Weight had overtaken the faction that said, "Finish it," and the war had moved into a kind of suspended state that neither side had a word for. June said she had a word for it. She said the word was argument. On the day the last Veth withdrawal patrol crossed the established boundary line, the one that gave humanity approximately 2/3 of the continent's livable land, which was more than there had been before the war. Since the war had apparently done something odd to the atmospheric processors the Veth had installed early on that had inadvertently reclaimed 3 dead zones, Kale sat outside with Blood in the evening light and didn't say anything for a long time. Blood had his head in Kale's lap, which was not something he did often. It was an old gesture, from when Kale had been 11 and Blood had been 2, and neither of them had the vocabulary yet for what they were to each other. "You should have told me about the signal," Kale said, not angry, just completing something. "Yes," T-Blood said. "I should have. 6 weeks is a long time to carry something alone." "You would know," T the dog said, with a gentleness that made the sharpness of it land without cutting. "You'd been carrying that chip for 3 years." Kale looked at the horizon, where the light was going down in layers, the way it always did in the scorch, because there were still particulates in the upper atmosphere that scattered the spectrum wide and made the sunsets longer and more complicated than they'd been before, beautiful in their way. He had noticed this years ago and still noticed it. Blood had told him once that this was specifically human, this tendency to find the aesthetics of catastrophe, and that he found it both infuriating and deeply reassuring. He took out the comm chip. He held it in the light. He thought about his mother, who had been a storyteller and a worker and a person who had included the wrong things in her stories because she'd believed in their necessity. "She would have liked June," T-Blood said. "Yes, she would have been proud of you." Kale turned the chip over in his palm. He thought about 19 seconds. He thought about the Veth in that chamber, translating grief as a building material, working through the idea that a species could construct with loss rather than be ended by it. He thought about the lullaby, slightly wrong in the places he wasn't sure about. He put the chip in his pocket, where it would stay. "You know," T.I. Blood said, lifting his head and looking east toward the boundary line where, for the first time in 11 years, nothing was moving in the dark. For a species with a nearly unprecedented capacity for making everything harder than it needs to be, don't. You occasionally do something genuinely remarkable, Blood. I'm just saying." Kale put his hand on the dog's neck, in the warm fur, in the last of the light. "I know," he said. "I know you are." They sat there until the dark came down, the boy and his dog, with the stars coming out above the scorch in their particular and irreducible abundance, the way they always did, the way they always would.